Great, you clicked and you're back listening. Thanks. This episode then, in part, I want us to bug out, to get down, to get into the groove. Yes, the warm crackle of vinyl there. So far in these data stories, this podcast, we've delved into the world of data and activism, data and optimism, and not forgetting data and love. Today the focus is on data and music. Today we want to talk about the analogue format, focusing on it as being an ecological friend, an ally in combating climate change. And there are bonuses for music engineers too. Creatively speaking, analogue apparently helps artists get into weird experimentation, and we'll see how this works in the dark wave sounds of King Krule and his release of Man Alive on Panther Records and Excel Recordings this month. And the idea is that analogue, spinning vinyl rather than streaming your music, can save the planet. Yep, seriously. But more simply, what gives with these music streaming platforms like Spotify? Ecologically, they pollute massively more than the other record formats used throughout history. Well, all the recorded and produced music, surpassing both the eras of vinyl and CD, making the streaming format the biggest ever polluter of them all. It is 2020, and in terms of music production, analogue basically translates to the format vinyl really well. The format is not only on trend and turning record labels a profit, it's good for breaking up the monotony of your neighborhood. I mean, how many record stores have you spotted recently? For me, it's in the dozens in the 11th and 12th districts of Paris. Even beyond the commercial growth of analogue, new research reveals that listening to your favourite track, your favourite music artist on vinyl, not streaming it, it shreds, literally minimises greenhouse emissions, those pesky CO2 emissions. At this point then, I'm thinking, does Greta stream her music? Do eco-activists dream of electronic streaming? But literally, puns aside, on saving the planet, the experts suggest that we have just 18 months left to drastically reduce carbon emissions. Playing vinyl then? Yes, playing a track on vinyl on a deck. Ah, you monster.
Sorry, dude.
Hey, careful with that stylus, you flaming muppet.
I got it.
Hey, vinyl picks up scratches, you know.
I'll be more careful. But dude, you're basically telling me that spinning vinyl reduces CO2 emissions. Vinyl's petroleum, dude. Toxic. Fake news, bro. What's spinning tunes got to do with climate change? I mean, streaming must be cleaner.
Okay, man. Fake news it, eh?
Yeah.
Literally, pumping out sound waves on an analogue format like vinyl takes a fraction of the energy consumption that otherwise is generated by playing the same music on streaming services like YouTube and streaming platforms like Spotify.
Really?
So I am telling you that the quantity of electricity generated to spin this piece of plastic there, and for this tiny diamond stylus, this needle, for it to pick up the sound waves embedded in the peaks and the troughs of the etched groove on that record's surface, to amplify that into an audible sound, to amplify the analog sound, there is less pollution than on streaming.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yep, listening to the same dope sounds on your bins, on your AirPods, your B&Os, well, whatever leading brand of ear furniture that you choose to listen on, streaming the same dope sounds through YouTube or Spotify on repeat, again, repeat, on autoplay. That requires bandwidth, which in turn requires energy production, fossil fuels, and heaps of the server centers which host these dematerialized digital units of music, the binary zeros and ones which we jack into. These tracks, you are burning fossil fuels with each stream.
Okay.
We're talking coal. Streaming is barbecuing the planet.
Okay.
let's get another room to get on with this episode and leave our audiophile, our vinyl junkie, to his own devices. After all, we've got a podcast to get on with. Today's story, data story, we're talking about data and music, particularly the commercial spectrum where music formats have gone from analog to digital over the years, and the trend is possibly edging back to analog for the sake of the planet. And well, is this habit of streaming actually barbecuing the planet? Tentatively, I'm going to say yes, but equally no. Why so? Why be so equal? Let's delve into platform streaming versus radio stations to see what's actually going down in the UK market. So, is Spotify anytime yet going to be taking over traditional broadcast radio? Well, trading as Spotify Technology SA, its free tier service has attracted 25% of the wake-up and early evening market. The wake-up and early evening are the peak periods when a high proportion of the working population are either going to work or returning from work. And this 25% of listeners absorbs the millennial age bracket range, something like between 18 to 34 years old, so slightly beyond. And that quarter, that 25%, although behind traditional radio stations, is still a high percentage and increasing. The Swedish-based streaming giant spans and is valued at $26 billion. However, even after 14 years of trading, even today, the company makes a loss. Annually, it bleeds around $10 million. So literally, the company over 14 years has survived even though it's never really turned a profit. But as a data producing company, this data aspect seems to attract external investors all the same. Data is today's valuable trading currency. But right now, which of its streaming subscription models is more ecologically friendly? Its freemium free tier service or premium paid tier service? The freemium model being the one where you don't pay, but you simply have to put up with annoying adverts interrupting the music. To put a stop to the annoying adverts, the incessant publicity, you pay for the premium service, and you pay around €10 monthly, and which allows you to bypass or avoid publicity. Take a pause while I'll just go and see if the other Paul is treating that vinyl okay. Yeah, I have a vinyl going. Okay, so freemium or premium, which of the two can slow down this ecological barbecue? Let's have a quick think. I figured the free subscription model probably emits less CO2, thinking logically that simply because listeners have less autonomy over skipping tracks. In the free tier mode, you can skip the odd track. You have a limitation of 3 per hour. So I thought less skipping means less streaming, so less bandwidth. But it seems not the case. It's more of a personal radio station. Unlike broadcast radio, which transmits one squeezed signal to, let's say, millions of potential listeners, Spotify radio is technically different and transmits radio to an estimated 217 million active users at any one time. It means that in as many streams, exactly that same amount, there are 217 million streams across 59 countries being delivered to listeners at any one time. So the free tier subscription model then, I don't think so. The publicity-supported subscription model has probably reached its peak. The free tier models encourage more streams, so encourage an ever more increasing release of CO2 emissions. What about then the premium paid tier model? Okay, well, for all the flexibility of skipping tracks and playing anything from the last 100 years of back catalogue of music, I suppose Spotify's best feature for reducing CO2 emissions is the play offline feature. Press the offline track option and the tracks get localized on your device or laptop's cache. It's offline memory, it's internal memory, and you can listen even when you can't catch Wi-Fi and there's no 4G or 5G network signal. Even if you were to play the tracks on repeat 20 times a week, if they're downloaded to your device, it still equates to only one stream. And that was the stream required for offlining the track. Therefore, offlining your music uses a fraction of the bandwidth and so less carbon emissions. That barbecue doesn't seem so out of control anymore then. But no, streaming platform bosses and shareholders, its financial investors, have a big responsibility on their shoulders to rethink the business model. Instead of sitting back and waiting for their big, fat-dripping, juicy, flame-grilled rump steak to come off that global barbecue, they in fact have begun to react to this little problem of CO2 emission. More on that later, but in the meantime then, how can how can you and me do our part to slow down this impending barbecue? Do you need to stop streaming? Do you need to stop this podcast? I mean, I'm part of the problem if I'm encouraging you to stream this. We've obviously got to get back to some way of enjoying music collectively, or at least offline. Here's some analysis through a look at the latest Panther Records XL recordings release from one and only King Krule, called Man Alive, and released just last Friday, the 21st of February, and played on my home deck numerous times. Maybe this album is a game changer, an attempt at pushing us to a more collective musical listening experience beyond the tyranny of the streamed playlist. Come on, Krule, that's Krule. He titled his new record Man Alive. Maybe a war cry, Man Alive. I repeat, to save the planet, the experts say, we have just 18 months left to drastically cut emissions. Man Alive, King Krule, you've got this. Let's look at the CO2 emissions and streaming imperative then. In Google, just as I got you to do last time for the Data and Love episode, I want you to this time imagine keying in the search words Spotify plus King Krule. The search results, click it and you're on his Spotify page. There's a lovely picture of the dude, a photographic portrait of Krule floods the screen. And it's the statistics, the metrics we are interested in just above the green play button. The number indicates a figure just shy of 1.5 million. This 1.5 million being the quantity of monthly listeners who've streamed King Krule's music. So, what can these metrics, these stats, these statistics reveal? They can help us roughly calculate Spotify's ecological score. We can start at the inferior figure of 1.5 million monthly listeners for King Krule. Maybe his fans get their Krule music fix from other channels and formats other than Spotify or streaming. Vinyl, maybe. But a limitless source of digitized units of music, more than 30 million units of tracks, Spotify reaches across established and emerging global markets to attract all types of music tribe. Continuing our search, we can seek out the nostalgia tribes and count that an artist like Billie Holiday reaches an equally modest 2 million monthly listeners, equivalent to an average US city population. In the Korean market, this metric rockets to 16 million monthly listeners for K-pop boy band BTS. That's a quarter of Korea's population. And for the British 18-year-old Billie Eilish, her monthly listeners peak an astronomical, staggering 60 million monthly listeners, around the population of the UK. Like the Chinese Tencent Music and the US's YouTube, the Stockholm-based Swedish platform Spotify attracts criticism for its greenhouse emissions, and so for the last few years the company has been considering ways of how to answer the problem of fossil fuel emissions coming from its server centres. The eco-activist organisation Greenpeace has a website which rates the energy efficiency of all the streaming services. It's called Greenpeace's Click Clean Scorecard. Making an ecological commitment. In 2017, Spotify did publish its first publicly available sustainability report. In it, the company committed to achieving carbon neutrality. In 2018, Spotify then decommissioned 6 of its 7 data centers, migrating its server operations to the GCP, the Google Cloud Platform. This sounds good. They are putting their best foot forward, but wait, yes, they claim the new server reduces its carbon footprint by something like 1,500 tons. I don't know how to equate that. But basically, they're saying it's making the streaming service almost entirely carbon neutral. But critics have said these popular streaming platforms, realizing they have an imminent ecological responsibility, have simply jumped onto the green bandwagon. Basically, it's good business practice to be seen to be green. Alliteration there. Be seen to be green. But the green bandwagon, it's when a company latches itself onto a massive trend which the public is passionate about. The new relationship realigns its values with that of the public, and so it makes good public relations, PR, to put the act of reducing greenhouse gases, CO2 emissions, at the heart of a capitalist business model, business alchemy. Basically reducing a catastrophic problem into a significant business opportunity. It's probable that Spotify Technology SA's data centers are pumping out less greenhouse gases, yes, than they did 5 years ago, but here's the issue. Achieving carbon neutrality doesn't actually mean a business needs to reduce its CO2 emissions. All they need demonstrate is investment in renewables, renewable energy sources. The calculation is in the word offset. Basically, purchase, or even better, invest in renewable energy sources. And this investment can be offset against the volume of CO2 emissions. Continue to pollute, but show you are willing to pollute less. It's a good honest case of greenwashing. A data story about music, a data story about analogue. The key aspect of today's episode, there may be a renewed and growing commercial interest in new vinyl, which might just help reduce our individual ecological CO2 footprint. One of this month's latest vinyl releases then, as of the 21st of February 2020, and well worth getting your hands on a copy, is Man Alive, the highly anticipated release of South London born Archie Marshall, who through his also known as name King Krule often talks about during interviews of being raised as an analogue child, which basically meant drawing on the walls in his family homes, his mum's and his dad's places, and kept sketch pads of his drawings. Known to his parents as Archie Marshall, this 20-something-year-old lad's analogue hangover is making perfect business sense for record labels too. With Panther Records and Excel Recordings, they gave him a chance to explore his sonic vision, which goes beyond the MP3 playlist. And with that mentality, there's no sign of him sobering up and leaping solely into the dematerialized digital domain. For Marshall, or Krule, whichever name you prefer, for sure it's obvious. For him, it's a no-brainer to release his music with a well-considered physical artistic printed component, leading to a broader musical experience. Being a kid who hated school, he fought not to attend. His otherwise analog surroundings subsumed his imagination, which spun his self-directed, deeply focused musical discovery. For the London-born songwriter-guitarist, creative honesty literally seems to ooze from his pores. In the book titled The Revenge of Analogue, Real Things and Why They Matter, from author David Sachs, a New York Times top 10 reader back in 2016, Sachs actually avoids the argument that streaming kills the audible quality of music of its vinyl counterpart, but more focuses on the musical making process. Analogue means less fiddling with the auto-tuning of music, favouring a more spontaneous sound. One of the sound engineers interviewed for The Revenge of Analogue distills this problematic perfectly in 2 sentences. I think that sound quality is one of the smaller reasons why analogue is used. Really, it's the process. This stuff, he said, sweeping his arms across the laboratory of painfully restored 40-year-old gear, it is designed by musicians primarily to record themselves. The digital version, Pro Tools, was designed by engineers. And with that idea chiming in my mind, I was eager to know more if Archie Marshall, aka King Krule, chased the analog sound, embracing the analog process. To do so, I staggered pretty endlessly, ironically ramping up my carbon footprint, trawling through an endless stream of music blogs and YouTube channels to see if it was the case. I just needed to know, and the website which hit the right note was Australian blog IOU. IOU itself being a record label which has pitched the right question to Marshall, asking Marshall, what is your process? And here's Archie Marshall's response. In his own words, I think the album is built around that weird experimentation of analog equipment. I recorded this LP in a studio with a guy called Andy Ramsey, and he was the engineer. He's the drummer in a band called Stereolab, and he has so much crazy equipment. I really got my teeth into it, and I spent hours creating pointless sort of delay channels and other shit like that. To which the interviewer of IOU chimes in with, fantastic, we love hearing stuff like that. It seems then that Archie Marshall's engineer, Andy Ramsey, a well-respected musician himself from the legendary post-rock band Stereolab, provided the terrain for the sound of King Krule's album. On the outro, a final note, the sleeve notes to end this episode. What about stopping streaming then? Well, if you stream, I'd favour listening to albums over tracks. Immerse yourself in the musician's vision and avoid one track from this artist and one from another. Ditch the dematerialised playlist. Enough said. Peace out. Get that stylus lined up. And as an epilogue to this episode, what's my journey? What's been my listening experience? As a teenager, I was spending my pocket money and money earned from a paper round paying a lousy £6 a week on these records. So heading down to the local high street record store, you'd pick up a 7-inch single, a 45 RPM. I was that teenager heading to the local Woolworths in Dudley, but also Our Price Records. But it was at the top of Dudley High Street near the geographically named Top Church, where the real muso heaven was located. The place, still vivid in my memory, was called Record Rack. A blast from the past indeed. For a lad growing up in an average UK town, record hunting was a much needed creative outlet. And Dudley also had the famous indie jaunt JB's, where most of the indie bands of the 1980s indie scene made their debuts. We're talking Pop Will Eat Itself, Chumbawamba. It's where I experimented with LSD, and also a pretty sociable place where we collectively heard the news on the eve of Tony Blair's Labour government winning the election, so tearing it out of the hands of the Tory Conservative government. In the meantime then, how can how can you and me do our part to slow down this impending barbecue? So my first note to self is have more house parties that'll reduce your personal streaming carbon footprint. So second note to self, get clubbing more and attend more album listening parties and attend more gigs. That will reduce my personal streaming carbon footprint. A third but not last note to self then is buy the tracks I play often on a permanent format, either vinyl or CD, or even FLAC download, and invest in a decent turntable or CD deck to play it on. Fourth and final note to self then is continue discovering bands on the app Bandcamp. Yeah, it's streaming, but at least on Bandcamp I can pay the artist directly if I like the tracks on the album, and then download the original files and listen to my heart's content. So that's it. That's the end of this podcast episode. Maybe leave your comments. Are you streaming tracks, or are you more into the full album listening experience? So that's today's episode, Data and Music, Analogue. And okay, so as usual, I would like to remind you that if you like the podcast and you want to help me, you can leave an evaluation on iTunes if you listen there, or on other platforms like Spotify. That way I can reach more listeners and maybe help more people up their English. Of course, there will be a new podcast episode soon, and during that I'm pretty sure I'm going to look at the footballer Justin Fashanu, whose name has just been added to the list in the Footballers Hall of Fame. Okay, so thanks streamers, I'm out of here. Peace up. Bye bye.